obviously Madam Ambassador for being here, and other MPs for also gracing us with their presence. Just as an introduction, Restless Beings, which is our organisation, has for the last 11 years actively been working on the Rohingya community of Burma. And over that last decade, we've had many media houses such as the BBC, CNN, AFP, Channel 4 gain access to the Rohingya in Burma. We've facilitated many think tanks and research bodies like the ODI, being key facilitators for members of parliament or high-profile celebrity types trying to gain access to the camps. We've been a very strong advocate for the British government in terms of trying to provide policy changes so that we can look at this situation in a better way. And as well as doing that, we've also been a humanitarian organisation. We've distributed about 600 tons of aid and assisted about 140,000 people in the last 18 months since 2017. Now, without doubt, the situation for the Rohingya has worsened over the years, and more specifically, it's also without doubt that the approach of the Burmese military has been getting progressively worse and progressively more aggressive. What's also without doubt is that the notion of what we call an international community till now has not really addressed the situation with success, and perhaps probably more realistically, it's been quite impotent in its approach and its response thus far. As an organisation, Restless Beings, we exist in a kind of space between human rights advocacy, defending, and humanitarian action. And it's from the voice of an activist that I would like to speak today. I was asked to give an update on the on-the-ground situation in Bangladesh. So first of all, I'm sure everyone's aware of the term Kutupalong and Balukali, which is the major refugee camp. This, when we first investigated in 2008, we found that there was 90,000 people amongst the official and the unofficial camps there. There are other camps as well, aside from this, places like Unchiprong, Leda Bazar, Tankali, so many other, Shamapur, for example. Just to give you a comparative idea, so again, like I said, in 2008, Kutupalong housed 90,000 people. Today it houses over 500,000. In 2008, Leda Bazar housed about 13,000 people. Today it houses almost 40,000 people. In 2008, Shamapur housed about 1,500 people. Today it houses about 10,000 people. So the swelling of population is an unbelievable and very remarkable phenomenon in itself. That in itself is crazy for the Bangladeshi authorities to have to deal with. And they have dealt with the influx of refugees remarkably well, considering their own economic condition. What happens, obviously, so many people are pouring into these camps. The world reacts with tens of millions of dollars of aid arriving from humanitarian organizations all over the world. And generally, obviously, the public was moved by seeing all these images across our news screens and from our politicians and whatnot, and our newscasters giving us information almost on a daily basis in September, October, November of 2017. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't mistakes made. There were plenty of mistakes made while assisting the genocide survivors, and that probably those mistakes made at that time go a long way to explaining where we are today in 2019. So first of all, many of the existing refugee population were largely ignored. So I'm talking about the guys who came in 1990s or in the early 2000s. Those people who made up the refugee population prior to the 2017 population, they were largely ignored. So for example, in Kutupalong, we visited some communities in 2015, and at that time they had 5 meter by 4 meter huts. They were split into 2 rooms. There was a kitchen area, there was a bathroom area. But in 2018, a decision was made by humanitarian organizations to tear these 5 meter by 4 meter homes down and rebuild them with 2 meter by 2 meter 1-room homes. And of course, what that means is that there's going to be a discord between those who have recently arrived who had nothing and those who were previously arrived who had something but now are being given even less than they originally had in the first instance. In Shamlapur, for example, we found the new arrivals had received UNHCR emblazoned thick material for tenting, whereas the existing population were relying on kind of like black plastic thin bags that we use for throwing away our garbage here. So when they requested to have these thicker material, they were told, well, no, you're not a new refugee, therefore you're not allowed to get this. This kind of crazy decisions is what leads to discord within a refugee community, whether that's an old existing refugee community or a new existing refugee community. This kind of mismanagement happened all over the place. On on a political level, as months passed by, Burma and Bangladesh, of course, agreed a repatriation deal. And it was agreed actually in November last year for that repatriation to start. We were actually in the camps at that time. I remember meeting a man, and he had run away from the Unchikan camps that he was originally from. And when we encountered him in the forest. We were literally making our way between 2 points. So we were not on the road, we were kind of walking through a forest. We encountered this man. He'd seen that we were interviewing people along the way, and it's very, very rare that a Rohingya person wants to come and have a camera pointed at them and that they want to say something. But this guy was waiting in line. You know, after we finished everything, he was like, "Are you going to talk to me now?" So we spoke to him, and we didn't have to say much. He just didn't understand why his parents, his wife, his children were not being forced to go back to Bangladesh, but he was. And here's the crux of the issue. Up until now, whether we're talking about relocation or repatriation, whether we're talking about dignity of aid or anything else, no one, not the Bangladesh government, not the Burmese government obviously, not the UN, any of its bodies, any third government, any humanitarian organizations of any real credibility, ever asked the Rohingya, what do you want? What do you need? What is necessary for you? And so therefore what we have is we have a situation where we are assuming as an international community, therefore, I say international community because I don't even believe in that notion, but as an international community, what is right for the Rohingya people? And we have never even made the first attempt to ask them themselves. And the diaspora doesn't count. I don't mean any disrespect to brothers Nesalun and Tunkin and others. We're talking about the people in the situation right now. Unless they have a seat at the table, all of our discourse is impotent. It's not even necessary. We can't decide people's fate without their input at the very first instance. Moving on to Basanchar, which is the island. So the Bangladesh government has built 100,000 structures for 100,000 people there. Guess what? They didn't consult the Rohingya there either. So now we have an island which has changed shape 8 times in the last 15 years, which has had millions of dollars invested, 100,000 homes have now been built, but no consultation to the people who are going to eventually live there, the Rohingya, was taken. So of course you're going to get some sort of rebuttal from the Rohingya community, but also from humanitarian organizations who are going to say, this is absolutely crazy. How can you take 100,000 people, which are, it's a minimum of a 1.5 hour boat ride away from the nearest kind of humanity. It's 12 hours away from the rest of the Rohingya community in Cox's Bazar. I mean, we're sending them to an absolute wilderness with no idea what's going to happen this monsoon season. So without that consultation, again, we see bizarre decisions being made. This is a double displacement. So we're now saying that the Bangladesh government will now displace these people away from their Rohingya refugee community camps in Cox's Bazar now to somewhere else. So if we're going to use the terms of law and we're going to use the terms of humanitarian organizations and human rights words, it's double displacement, and it's enforced double displacements. This is not a displacement that is required, it's not necessary, it's something that we have almost volunteered ourselves into. It didn't happen, the repatriation didn't happen in November 2008. In October 2018 there was also supposed to be the first people going to Basanchar. That didn't happen. And that's because of the pressure that the international community, whether that's human rights organizations or governments or politicians and journalists, standing up for what's actually right and saying, no, this is not correct. But what we've also seen is that countless times that the Rohingya themselves inside the camps have actually organized. We say that the camps are closed at 5 p.m. Anyone who's been to the camp will know that. 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock, you have to leave. At 5 o'clock the camps are closed off. But after 5 o'clock, obviously there's a level of organization, because whenever there's a high profile visit from someone from the UN or someone from the EU or some member of parliament or some celebrity from some place, there's always a joint response. There's always seems to be some sort of action. So that can tell you, and I can personally vouch, I've personally been there post 5 p.m. I can personally vouch that there is organization, and it's that self-organization, that self-resilience, which should encourage everyone that the Rohingya voice, the agency of their voice, should be brought to the table. We keep saying that they're, an unlearned people, they're fishermen, they're rural people. How do they organize in that case? They obviously have the capability, right? So we should not patronize them in that way. We should bring them to the table, because it's their seat which is the most important seat. back to the notion of bus and char, I'm going to finish, but I just wanted to say this. It's imperative that the Bangladeshi plans of relocating, or perhaps correctly, it's kind of like forcibly removing 103,000 people next month is started to happen in April 2019. We need to challenge that sufficiently. There can be no doubt that the island is not fit for purpose. That is if the purpose is of housing a refugee population. But if it's a purpose of sending 100,000 people to a part of the country so secluded that they can be forgotten about, okay, it's fit for that purpose. If it's for the purpose of sending 100,000 people as an experiment to see what happens when we take an island and build some, defense, flood defense walls and whatnot, yeah, okay, it might be fit for that purpose as well. It may also be fit for the purpose of maybe generating income for further development of other islands, so that other islands, in Bangladesh, which is a country obviously challenged by climate change, maybe that is fit for that purpose. So in terms of actually looking after human beings, looking after refugees, it's totally not fit for purpose. It's fit for purpose when British designers and Chinese contractors and Bangladeshi Navy have designed, planned and implemented this island to look like a modern day slave island. But it's not an island for refugees. It's not an island for genocide survivors. It's not an island made out of compassion. I call on the members of European Parliament who are not here, but for anyone who's watching, Madam Ambassador as well, with the leverage that you have, other governing structures, academics alike, activists, legal professionals, and everyone else to join Ask Restless Beings in writing an open letter to the Bangladesh government to rethink its strategy in bus and char. I don't want us to tell Bangladesh what to do, but it should at least rethink its strategy to a certain degree. It's shown Bangladesh, it's shown remarkable leadership up until now. It's shown remarkable compassion up until now to actually handle this genocide, especially when we look at Europe, when we turn our borders away to people arriving from Libya and Syria, whether it's the US turning its borders away from its own issues that it has. Let's not go into that because that's another 1 hour discussion in itself. But Bangladesh has done remarkable up until now. It's actually not fitting with its character over the last 18 months to send 100,000 people to this island. It's not fitting with its character of the last 18 months to say now we're going to close the borders off, because it's been not one of the compassionate countries, it's been the only compassionate country for the Rohingya so far. It's not done well, it's done the most it can do. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't challenge it further. We shouldn't just because get lost in that congratulating and not be able to be a voice of reason, for this. And the island experiment of bus and char definitely needs to be thought about again. I want to kind of close up, so I'm just going to say my last I had loads more to say, Zani, but I'm going to close up a little bit. I just wanted to say the Bangladesh government obviously has made questionable decisions, such as the failed repatriation deal and the unthinkable relocation to bus and char. But that's only has happened because other more powerful countries, other more powerful agencies, bodies like the EU and the UN have not said enough. And that's what that does, is it's reaffirmed Myanmar, Burma's position as being a genocidal state because they have not been challenged. The UN, its associated bodies, countless other humanitarian organizations have not organized properly to feed into the joint response plan. Obviously, ultimately, the responsibility lies with the Burmese, the country of origin, the state that's inflicted this genocide on them. But we haven't helped along the way. When I say we, I'm talking about Europe, I'm talking about the US, I'm talking about other bodies. We haven't helped along the way. The education now, we also have had a lot of talk about education. It's now also being weaponized by the Bangladesh government, unfortunately. When we use terms such as pull factor, which is what the Bangladesh authorities have done numerous times over the last few months, as a reason for why the Rohingya are coming to Bangladesh. It's not a pull factor. Bangladesh, the Rohingyas are not escaping Burma so they can come to Bangladesh so they can educate their children to a standard which is not even sufficient to their own standards. That's not the reason why they're coming. We can't use these terms because it weaponizes the whole Rohingya movement. It weaponizes education, and that's not what's going on. The action and voice to change status quo that was mentioned earlier on, it's not there because the religious institutions, the mosques, the madrasas, they're only allowed to do the 5 daily prayers. The education institutions are only allowed to give basic education. There are no other agency for the Rohingya to move up and move on. Notions such as the Magnitsky Act, which was mentioned earlier on, are a really poor way of sanctioning, considering that the people who you would impose that on, the military leaders, they have absolutely no desire nor appetite to come to the EU in the first instance. It's useless. I am afraid that we need to up the game in terms of what we do here in the EU, in terms of holding to account the crime of genocide against the Rohingya in Burma. A real arms embargo, not just the talk of one. Real accountability in terms of ICG and ICC or ICC referrals. Actual vociferous action at the UN level are the minimum that's required. That's not the maximum, that's the absolute minimum. I congratulate the MEPs, I congratulate the Madam Ambassador here, but I don't think there's any use in us slapping each other's backs with glee unless we encourage other colleagues to also come on board so that this is a more solid movement, if you like. We need to constantly remind everyone that the Rohingya issue in the first instance and the fact that they've been rejected from Burmese mainstream is as a result of a European power using colonial rule in the first instance. We therefore have a collective moral responsibility regardless of our individual countries if we're going to group together as a nation of European states. The first step is to call it what it is, genocide. Steps that follow are for us to act collectively and apply the pressures available to us against the Burmese administration, but to also encourage and help the Bangladesh administration, and while suggestions like forced relocation, repatriation, they have to be taken off the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Brother, you took quite a bit of time.
I'm so sorry.
So can I give the floor to Doreen, then she can cover the criminal responsibility of...
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador, for being here, first of all. Thank you also to the Honourable Members Wajid Khan and Jose Faria, together with all of the co-sponsoring organisations, for the opportunity to address you today. So I've been asked to talk to you about protection and accountability for the Rohingya under international law. Now, people like me often preface discussions like this with the disclaimer that the issues to be discussed are very complex. Now, whatever the motivation for giving a disclaimer like that, the fact of the matter is that it's wrong. The bottom line here is ultimately simple. On accountability, it is that the state of Myanmar, together with its top military and civilian leaders and those most responsible, must be held to account under international law for the unimaginable atrocities that the Rohingya have endured. Let's be clear. These atrocities have unfolded so audaciously under our very noses that the failure to achieve accountability for them will be a major nail in the coffin for the international legal system. That system will be revealed to be toothless at precisely the moment when a decisive bite matters the most. On protection, the bottom line is equally straightforward. Rohingyas' fundamental human rights need protecting. And why is that? Because they're human beings. And woven into the fabric of our international community are the legal, the moral, the humanist principles that we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights and entitled to enjoy our human rights without distinction of any kind. These are rightfully the cornerstones of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, moreover, protection of the Rohingya is critical, not simply because of what they've already endured, but more importantly, to prevent any further violations. Again, if the system of international law cannot fulfill a preventive function, or at the very least administer basic vital triage for mass atrocity crimes, then what is it really good for? Now, in the limited time that I have today, I'll unpack the issues of accountability and protection for Rohingya under international law by considering two questions. And the first is, how can we characterize the Rohingya experience under international law? And then secondly, how is the Rohingya experience relevant to Europe? Turning to the first question, it was not long ago that the idea of legally characterizing the Rohingya experience as genocide was treated as radical. These days, that's changed pretty dramatically, I'd say. So much so that today, the activists and scholars that you've already heard from, who've argued for a characterization of genocide for many years, have now been joined not only by the Independent Permanent People's Tribunal for Myanmar, as well as some corners, not all, of civil society, but strikingly also by what we would call typically establishment entities. These include the Special Rapporteur for the Situation on Human Rights in Myanmar, Yang Lee, and the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar. And as you heard already, that fact-finding mission has argued for the prosecution of the heads of Myanmar military, including the Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing, for genocide and other international crimes. It's quite dramatic. And justifiably so. It is clear that what is happening to the Rohingya, what they have already endured, is indeed a genocide. And it's even arguable that this genocide is still ongoing today, and that the Rohingyas' uncertain fate, both in refugee camps and within Myanmar, could amount to genocide through the imposition of conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group. Rohingya have also suffered the full range of crimes against humanity. And here it's important to emphasize that these crimes are actually considered on par with genocide in terms of gravity. The evidence points to the crimes against humanity of persecution, deportation and forced transfer, as you all know, murder, enforced disappearances, torture, extermination, unlawful imprisonment, apartheid, and of course, rape and sexual slavery. And we can add to this list too a wide range of gross human rights violations and also war crimes, about which much can be said. But before we go any further, I think it's important for us to pause at this point and reflect. We should absolutely celebrate that we're finally calling the alleged crimes by their proper names, as Mukuru talked about. But at times, the discussion has swung too much towards the other extreme, so much so that sometimes technical jargon like genocide and crimes against humanity is being used without clarity about what they mean, and this risks creating misunderstanding and ultimately disappointment. So in that spirit, I believe that, let's take a moment to clarify. I believe that what is important to remember about genocide and crimes against humanity is what it is about them that makes them so-called mass atrocity crimes. And when it comes to genocide, this is the fact that for an act to be considered genocidal, it requires an intent to actually destroy a group because of that group's particular identity as a group, in whole or in substantial part. And when it comes to crimes against humanity, it is that what is required is that the crime took place as part of a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population. This means that we're talking, in other words, about crimes that are generally requiring not only sufficient control over instruments of violence to carry them out, but also, critically, an enabling political environment. And two important points follow from this. The first is that even if the alleged crimes in Myanmar were committed by soldiers or paramilitaries under the control of top military leadership, civilian political leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi can and should be held equally responsible. This is not only for omissions or complicity, as you said, in terms of failure to act when they should have acted, but also for creating the policies that enabled or even encouraged the crimes. For example, by systematically imposing systems of apartheid on the Rohingya for decades. Now, secondly and relatedly, states, as I mentioned, can also be held responsible in their own right for international crimes, like genocide under international law. And the focus of the discussion up until now has generally tended to be on individual criminal responsibility. And of course, it is certainly important that leaders be held accountable for their actions, including by facing the possibility of being imprisoned. However, and as I briefly discussed, we should also note that there are pathways, such as bringing a case to the International Court of Justice, that can hold the state of Myanmar directly to account for violating the Genocide Convention. And this pathway has certain advantages too, such as the possibility of immediately imposing measures on Myanmar to prevent it from doing anything to worsen the situation of the Rohingya. This, as you can tell, could be an important tool for protection and prevention. Now, it's also important to avoid looking at the accountability question too much through the lens of the possible International Criminal Court case on the Rohingya, and to think that this case will somehow be enough in terms of achieving accountability. This is because if that case goes ahead at all, it will likely be limited to the August 2017 onwards deportation of some 700,000 Rohingya from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And while those events are certainly a watershed moment for the Rohingya, we must also recall that they're only the latest chapter in a long series of events endured by the Rohingya people, as Tung Kin talked about earlier. Accountability ought to be sought for as much of that suffering as legally possible to represent the full spectrum of the sustained intergenerational suffering of the Rohingya. And in this sense, we need to call upon the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, which has none of the jurisdictional constraints of the International Criminal Court, to accordingly train its focus in this direction, I think. And for that matter, it's also important to bear in mind that it's not only the Rohingya who've been ostracized as the other by Myanmar and then systematically targeted and oppressed. This has occurred inter-ethnically. So while we should absolutely always advocate for the Rohingya, we should equally support accountability and protection for other ethnic groups in Myanmar who also suffered, including other Muslim groups, and the Kachin, the Shan, the Karen, among others, and in full solidarity. Now, with the remaining time that I have, I'll just turn briefly to look at that second question, which is how the Rohingya experience is relevant to the European Parliament and to the European people. Now, we talked about the fact that Europe isn't directly responsible for what's happened to the Rohingya, but it is true that Europe is nonetheless at the epicenter of the Rohingya experience in one key sense. And that is that it was primarily the European experience in World War I and World War II that gave birth to the modern international system through which we're seeking accountability and protection for the Rohingya at all. The European experience is indelibly written into every aspect of the international crimes allegedly perpetrated against the Rohingya for which we seek accountability. Crimes against humanity, for example, were first identified and prosecuted at the Nuremberg Tribunal. The crime of genocide, as you heard, was born specifically out of the events of the Holocaust. The shape of war crimes was also fundamentally redrawn following these two total wars. Similarly, the Rohingya's fundamental human rights that we strive to protect may have been enshrined originally in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but they were first properly fleshed out in detail in the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. More importantly, they are the foundational values, as you heard the MEPs mention, that underpin not only this European Parliament where we are today, but also the project, the very idea of Europe itself, which is built, officially at least, around human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and human rights. Now this matters because this legacy means that Europe and the European people not only have the unique opportunity, but arguably the moral imperative to take a strong position in terms of accountability and protection for the Rohingya. And this is acutely important when we note that the moral leadership vacuum on the international stage is unfortunately rapidly expanding, and it's fanned in particular by the current President of the United States and other leaders cut from the same cloth. Now, in the event that Europe has momentarily forgotten its painful past, the Rohingya experience can also serve as a timely wake-up call. For what has happened to the Rohingya is the cautionary tale and the textbook example of what inevitably happens when you allow political fear-mongering, xenophobia, and Islamophobia to run rampant. Sentiments that are steadily regaining traction here in Europe and elsewhere as well, including, sadly, in my own home country of Australia, as the tragic mosque shootings in New Zealand last week by an Australian make painfully clear. Now, as you've heard from many panellists, it's too late to speak of never again in the case of the Rohingya, but we can still seek accountability for what's happened. We can still protect the Rohingya against any further violations, and we can still try to prevent this from happening again, whether to Rohingya or anyone else. Europe is particularly well placed to demonstrate moral leadership by throwing its full support behind those efforts, and we urge you to do so. Thank you very much.
So we have maybe 10-15 minutes before the yes, perfect time. How do you know? So we are just about to have a discussion and a small group, and so
Great.
Yeah. So what we have covered so far is the pathways to different types of international accountability that the European Union and other bodies should explore, because they have the teeth to bite rather than most statements and resolutions, and also holding individual perpetrators in leadership position accountable is crucial, as Doreen pointed out just now, because if we don't do that, we simply send the wrong signal to future perpetrators that you can commit this crime on this magnitude and get away. Yeah, and also it actually every one of us who believe in the norm-based, rule-based international system should be acutely concerned if the accountability is not pursued, because, as Doreen put it, it would be basically a final nail in the coffin of international, judicial and justice systems. And then Brother Mabra spent a lot of time talking about, the mistakes that Bangladesh government is about to make. And Bangladesh has been basically a model society, a model government. We know that Hasina's government is problematic on the human rights front in terms of its crackdown on opposition and human rights, and so we don't need to be polite when a government, whatever the name of the government, is engaged in the verifiable violations of the rights of citizens to organize and to oppose, to peacefully try to change the government. But despite the fact that the government of Sheikh Hasina has won justifiably international praise. It is widely admired around the world. Why would they want to squander the moral leadership that they have built themselves? And the last thing the Prime Minister of Bangladesh wants to do is basically repeat Aung San Suu Kyi's behavior. Yeah, and like fortunes change so quickly when public figures make irreparable damage to their own reputation, and Aung San Suu Kyi is the classic example. So I think what we want to appeal here to the European Union as a donor is not to be polite when 100,000 Rohingyas' lives are at stake. And also, I think Dhaka is asking the United Nations and the donor countries to fund this relocation. And the cost is the cost of the constructing this island. That Yang Hee herself, who I've never been there, Yang Hee went there. She questioned the how fit the island is for habitation, and if anyone who has been to any concentration camps or military barracks would know, the island resembles more like a concentration camp, anything else. And a friend of mine, a Bangladeshi, had a Freudian slip when he said, "Oh no, we will be treating the inmates well." Yeah? So it sums up the essence of this, and so I think I'll stop here, and I think there are a lot of issues to unpack. And I think it will be good to hear from Madam Ambassador in terms of the OIC's latest move on the ICJ. There is a unanimous resolution that OIC will pursue the ICJ pathway, and it will be grateful if you share some thoughts.
Okay. Are we going to listen to Ms. Begum, or you want me to talk?
I'm not presenting today.
You are not?
No.
Oh.
We're from the same organisation.
All right, okay, all right, because I thought you're there. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, the co-host and the organizers also, for this very important, a series of important meetings that has been held, but almost every one of you have mentioned, and which I also echo, that it's time for action. Much words have been spent, but it's time for action. Yeah. And I'll just say that, I am representing the OIC here as its ambassador, and I'm happy, and it's a privilege also that to represent the organization, because it has been very vocal on the question of the seriousness of the situation and the atrocities that are still being committed against the Rohingya community by the Myanmar authorities, both military and many of you have said also the civilian. And I won't really go into the details of our concern because it's very well known, and the OIC has also expressed indignation at the credible reports that have come out from the UN and other human rights organizations about the atrocities. And it has also been called ethnic cleansing. The term genocide has been repeated. So just to come to your question, I would say that the OIC believes that the restoration of peace in the Rakhine state, and before I mention that, I would also, as you have Mr. Zani mentioned in your beginning about the interfaith kind of peaceful dialogue and interfaith coexistence, it's the importance of it. The OIC entirely believes in that. And we had also organized in Bangkok, I think it was 2017 December, some interfaith dialogue with religious leaders in that area, which also includes Myanmar. So it believes that the restoration of total peace can be achieved if mechanisms are put in place to prevent the recurrence of the atrocities which are perpetrated, and the perpetrators should be held accountable for these atrocities. So accountability is the only guarantee of non-recurrence, and we should also need to address the root cause, the citizenship issue. These are very open position of the OIC. And in this regard, the OIC in all forum and also within will continue to seek for justice and accountability for the Rohingya people and ensure that the government of Myanmar fulfills its obligations under international law. As I see, you have been following very well, Mr. Zani, the OIC proceedings, and as recent as early this month, on the 1st of March, the 46th OIC Council of Foreign Ministers met in Abu Dhabi. And there are 3 resolutions on Myanmar on the human rights situation as well as on the accountability were adopted. I would refer to this one in particular, which established a 10-member ad hoc ministerial committee on accountability for human rights violations against the Rohingya It will be chaired by the Gambia. Just to give you a little idea, the ad hoc committee will, the resolution is there, you can consult the OIC website, but to say that, it will engage to ensure accountability and justice for the gross violations of the international human rights and humanitarian laws and principles you have also alluded to, or more than alluded, you have specifically mentioned. Assist in information gathering and evidence collection for accountability purposes. Mobilize and coordinate international political support for accountability for the human rights violations against the Rohingyas in Myanmar. Collaborate with international bodies such as Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, United Nations, and other international and regional mechanisms. This would also obviously include the European Union. And the members of the OICs have been called upon to carry out, to support the ad hoc committee, to help carry out the task of ensuring accountability and justice for the violations of the human rights, and coordinating international political support for accountability for the human rights violations against Rohingya in Myanmar. On this aspect, Mr. Member of Parliament, I know you are very much, engaged with this issue through you and also Wajid Khan MEP. We'd like to feel that already the European Parliament has adopted many resolutions, but it is now that there is a need to move on to ensure accountability and justice. And we are also engaged with the European Commission from the OIC, and the Secretary General himself is particularly focused on that issue.
May I just ask one very brief question,
Yes.
specifically? You said that the meeting was chaired by Gambia,
Yes.
and my understanding is that a resolution was unanimously adopted.
Yes.
For OIC, it's quite unusual because it's been rather divided on a lot of issues, and on this issue there is a strong political will. How far do you think, and the OIC will basically mount a legal challenge to Myanmar using the Genocide Convention, and who will be the leading OIC member state? In other words, we want to be supportive of this move, and we're on the same page, and so that's why I asked this question.
Well, the first is that it has been chaired by Gambia because the proposal to have such ad hoc ministerial committee came from Gambia in the Dhaka CFM last year, and following up on that, a meeting was held in Banjul, and then the report came to the CFM only in March. As regards to your other specific question, who will take the lead, it is not very obvious yet, because there has to be, because the mandate of the committee is the collections of informations and all that. Obviously, one country has to take a lead to take it to the ICJ.
Can I also ask you a question?
And it's too early to say because it was only adopted in March. Yes, sir, by all means.
Thank you, Mr.
I thought the question was from the other way. I should be asking
This is a free exchange of ideas, and I think that's how it should be. Now, we are going to have elections here in Parliament, European elections. What's your feeling on this issue? Because Europe is changing, and I think that's the most important thing to when we live here to think of that. Europe is changing, and I don't know if it's changing for the best. There are this mandate, this legislature, as we have seen a growing of populism movements, and extreme right and left, also political parties, and also forces within Parliament. it was not like that before, and it happened. And luckily, the extremists are divided, because if they were not divided, then we would have a bigger problem here in Parliament. Now, next elections, we don't know how this is going to be, because at the member states situation, like you have Poland, you have Hungary, and you have the other Visegrad countries, and you have Italy, and so on and so on and so on. You have Britain now leaving. There's a big impact on European policy and worldwide that can influence it. And in this particular issue with the Rohingyas, that's what we are discussing here. How do you feel as a representative of OIC? How do you perspective the next mandate, the next legislature to be? Will it be, because you had an interlocutor here in Parliament, for instance, Wajid, he might not be here. I don't know if I will be here or not, but do you think that it's a bit, as I said before, a bit of frustration also that we end a mandate and we haven't managed to end some of the things that we wanted to end, like for instance to have a better commitment from the European Union as a whole towards Rohingya, Venezuela the same, and Nicaragua and so on. There's a lot of issues that are still open and that will be left for next Parliament. Do you believe that next Parliament things? What's your perception of how things will be with next Parliament? Given
on
the Rohingyas, we are talking about the Rohingyas. That is, do you think that not being able to we had 6 resolutions here, but they are not, as you said, and I agree with you, they are not. They should have only have been 1 or 2, but strong, really strong ones, and these ones are not suitable. Let's be honest. Do you think there will be another one next legislature? What do you feel? Have we lost an opportunity here?
I think it wasn't personally speaking. You have raised issues that cannot be. It is very debatable, and it's not only one issue. But you're talking about the composition and makeup of a future European Parliament. But the European Parliament would there. You will continue to work. You did mention that some of the real proponents and die-hard supporters of the Rohingya cause may not be there, but I'm sure those who are advocates, lobbying in that sense, not paid lobbyists, but the moral lobbyists, would continue to focus on the future Parliament of the European Parliament, and we do hope. The OIC do hope that there will be opportunities for more engagement towards meaningful and effective action on the ground. Because much water has flown, and there needs to be action. And I'm not going to comment on the about the populist thing, but this is fact.
Yes.
I mean, we all read and we also see that that is very unfortunate. That would also be for the European taxpayers to talk about, not for me, because they are the one who will elect in the final analysis. So who they elect to that body to represent them, it is for them to look out, and we hope that you will be re-elected.
Thanks. But the thing is that the danger is there. That's what I wanted to say, and it's a pity, and that I agree with you. It's as far as I can go in that sense, is that I think we have lost an opportunity, honestly, because
I hope these conversations are not.
Transmission.
Are you doing it?
We are on live. Would you like us to close?
Yeah,
shut it
these
down?
are,
So we can have we turn it off. Yeah. Then we can have a more private conversation.